All right. So let's go over where the final's going to be. Final's going to be online. All right. Final will be 50 questions, multiple guests, equally coming from all three chapters. The reason I do it for online, quite simply, it's just easier. I mean, you'll the same knowledge and everything. The advantage for you as a student is you'll know exactly what your final grade is. You won't have to wait for me. And I understand where you are as a student. You need something less to worry about on the final. So, and I need something less to grade. So it works out mutually for our own benefit. All right. I'm finishing up the tests and I'm working through them. This is always the hardest test because there's so much to cover in 4 chapters. I wish I could split it up more, and I've tried it before, but generally students tell me that's a lot of tests. All I can say is I agree, and I can't cut the tests out, so we just plow through, we get it done, and then we come to the end. Okay, so final exam will be May 9th. It will be from 8 a.m. to 10:30. That's when the test will open, and then it will close. The bonus questions are 2 points apiece. It will open for 2 minutes and then close. All right. And I will have to add those points together to give you a total. Okay. So, final exam. We're in our last 2 weeks, plowing through. And now this is generally the chapters to me that are the most interesting. And a lot of students are very interested in these particular chapters because we're really talking about the nuts and bolts about how do we go about and achieve some kind of successful goals together. And instead of just talking about the actions themselves, the reasons for the actions kind of come into play a little bit more. So Walmart has a pretty eclectic history when it comes to supply chain. They're unique in that if I were to say the single number one strength that Walmart has over others, and it's one of those still that even though Amazon does quite well, in my consideration, Walmart does quite better, is supply chain. So way back in 1975 was actually when they first networked together. We're talking about thinking in that mind. We're talking about 50 years ago. Walmart actually networked their machines together in whatever the context was in that day. In 1992, they started a system known as vendor management inventory. And so what Walmart started doing was it started allowing vendors, literally, as I say, to manage their own inventory. But it sounds generous, but what did they have to do in order to do it? Walmart required that in order for you to be a vendor of the Walmart system, you would have to invest inexpensive equipment to be able to get into the ultimate Walmart system. It meant you had to buy machines that were at that time top of the line. And they insisted upon this. And for small organizations, it might have been very difficult. But what was to their advantage? Walmart allowed their vendors to see every single unit they had on every single shelf in real time all over the world, and allowed the vendors to manage the inventory for Walmart itself. Now, think about what the enormous amount of trust that it required for Walmart to do this, to be able to achieve the goals that they have. But they achieved enormous successes. Walmart eliminated something that was known as a dry ship. Dry shipping is when a truck moves across the United States and there's nothing in it. Now imagine if you're Walmart and you have thousands of trucks. Has anybody ever been to a Walmart distribution center? There's like 8 across the United States. They're gigantic, aren't they? They're as big as 10 football fields, and the trucks look like toys when you see them in the distance. These giant systems basically are there to be able to move goods back and forth across the United States, and they dedicated themselves to never having a single truck ever dry ship. Since 2002, they've been able to succeed in that goal, and to the enormous benefit of Walmart and finally to the customers, of course, it means lower costs. Doing this required them to exercise power. And that's an important thing to consider, because power has a lot of negative connotations, yet power can be used for good. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about power, and we're going to talk about it in its better uses. So, first, let's talk about power. First off, let's understand that every part of marketing channels is permeated by power. How do we measure power too? Because that's an extremely important thing. Power also is one of those things that's difficult because it's not equivalent. Organizations, whether they are the channel captains or the manufacturers or the wholesalers or the retailers, power in itself is not necessarily equal. And how do we understand and estimate power can be extremely difficult. And yet you must have power to be able to achieve your given goals. We talked about one of the difficulties, and we talked about this all during the semester, is that channels are interdependent, independent organizations that have their own reasons and purposes for existence. But in order to achieve success, organizations must act as if they're pursuing a single shared interest. Why? Because organizations must work together to serve the end users. It's as simple as that. Power needs to be done. Organizations must work together to achieve the goal of satisfying consumers. It's the core of marketing, all right? Marketing is here to be able to satisfy end users. To satisfy end users, we have to work together. And so, this is the definition of power. Power is the ability to get channel member A, the influencer, to get another channel member B, who is the individual who is being acted on, which is called the target, to do something that would that they otherwise would not have done. This is what power is. Power is the ability for channel member A the influencer to get another channel B, who is the target, to do something it otherwise would not have done. Power is the potential for influence, but it isn't necessarily the influence. Power is a very difficult subject to talk about because it's very difficult to be able to diagnose and understand. Power many times is ridden with what's called false positives. And so if I am a channel manufacturer who wishes to be able to get my wholesalers to stock more goods, and I use one of the influence strategies to get the individuals to do those things, I feel like my use of power might be successful. However, the wholesaler may have been expanding in that direction anyway. And so that's one of the difficulties with a false positive. A false positive is the result given for actions that might not be the actual reason. It can be speculative, it can be subject of abuse, may be impossible to verify, but then again, if you don't have it, or you don't try, then there is no influence. Now, here's one of the difficulties. Power, when it's used best, is when it benefits the entire system. And maximizing the channel system's profit is not the same as maximizing each individual corporation's profits. So here's one of the difficulties that you can have. A manufacturer can come out, and what they will do is that they will put a relatively high margin on their particular goods downstream to the wholesaler because they want to be able to recoup their investments. Well, the wholesaler, in response to that particularly high margin, may be, with their own personal need for survival, put their own high margins and then basically pass that downstream. This is what's called double marginalization. In essence, there are high costs that are associated because each channel member wants to be able to recoup their investments. And the difficulty, of course, with that is that it does not play or satisfy the consumer's best desires. This double marginalization can be a detriment. And here's one of the problems. This is one of those mantras. Left alone, channel members will not cooperate to achieve system level goals. Left by themselves, they will simply pursue their own interests, and this is where power comes into play. Walmart's demands to their downstream members might have seemed somewhat abusive at the time, but the advantage to the vendor systems cannot be minimized. It brought system level improvements, created a whole new genre for vendors to be able to see everything that's on every shelf. And if you can see everything on every shelf and you can collect that data over a period of time, you can do something else. You can forecast demand. You can anticipate demand and maximize the efficiencies of the manufacturing process itself. The advantages replicated across the entire Walmart system, all because Walmart demanded and insisted that their vendors make these investments. Power works when it achieves system level goals, and great benefits can be achieved. And here's the difficulties, of course. There are great chances for abuse. And this is where, folks, if you ever get into middle or upper management, or even then, I urge you to take a class on ethics, because ethics is extremely important, because ultimately power doesn't rest in organizations, it rests in individuals. One of my teachers used to say that when I was in PhD school, used to say it all the time, there are no organizations, there's only people. And people are the ones who decide to make rational and ethical choices. So, this is power. So there's two ways that you can actually measure and understand power, and there's two different types. One of them is what's called the 5 sources of power, and I'm not sure that you've had this yet, but trust me, if you're in supply chain, you'll be talking about power. If any of you take leadership psychology, this is an excellent foray into leadership as well. Because leadership is the exercise of power, but it is the appropriate use of power. And so we'll talk about the 5 sources of power. When we come back on Tuesday, we'll talk about dependence, which is the flip of power, and how do we go about exercising power to achieve the goals system-wide to help our consumers. So the first thing I want you to do is don't get knocked on this one. Of course, the way this slide goes is I'll show you the 5 and we'll break them down one at a time. Realize power can only be used if you have something valuable to give to the end user. If there isn't a skin in the game and there's no reason to execute power, it's worthless. And so you have to have something of value to the end user ultimately to be able to achieve it. Now, before I go on, I want to do something. So, what is that? Any idea? Yeah. See that? Anybody ever use a set like that? Tiny, aren't they? Okay. So these are my set of tools that I used when I was working on computers. I had to get out of it, by the way, because they got smaller and smaller and smaller. Although my hands still work, right? My eyes couldn't. And that's one of the reasons I'm not working on computers today. So my daughter had broken her laptop. And so I had to order some parts. And so I broke these out and haven't seen these in a while. So is this good or evil? Neither. Okay, very correct. This is a tool. These tools can be worthless in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to use them. They could be bad if there's evil intent, or they can do something good, like I hopefully am able to do for my daughter. It's in my hands to be able to use as I will. And so that's the same with power. Power is a tool. Power can be used for good, or it can be used in other ways. All right. And so I want you to think about this when you think about power, and the last 3 things that we're going to talk about in this particular chapter is that power can be useful or it can be unuseful. This is the other reason why ethics is so important in your life, for you to have consistent and virtuous reasons for doing the things that you do. Because whether they're good or bad, It depends on you. And so let's talk about the 5 uses of power. So the first one is reward power. If you do what I want, I'll give you a cookie. Reward power is a benefit given in return for a channel member's agreement to alter their behavior. The emphasis generally is on financial rewards for benefits in the channel. There can also be non-financial rewards as well. Trips, recognition, those kind of things. And so those efforts enable it to increase the profits by increasing rewards. The difficulty, of course, with reward power is if I tell my daughter, if you do your homework, you get a cookie, tomorrow she's going to say, I did my homework, where's my cookie? That's what'll get you to the dark side. They have cookies. You get to alter that behavior downstream. The downstream channels can reward producers, and there is some measure of success, but the difficulty with reward power is in and of itself, it's corrosive. And so reward power is one of those things that has to be very careful when you exercise the power. Reward power is pretty straightforward. You try to find ways to reward in unique, different ways that tend to be one time only, because the difficulty, of course, as I've said, is that positive reinforcement generally requires more and more positive reinforcement. What can be considered the flip side of reward power, which is actually not, is coercive power. Coercive power stems from B's expectation of punishment from A. If it fails to conform with A's influence attempt. And while they call it the flip side of reward power, it actually is not. As a matter of fact, it's much, much worse. Kind of think of, if you're going to think of it on a line, you think of reward power like here, and you think of coercive power right here. And the truth is that coercive is much stronger than reward power. Because coercive power implies a threat. And just think about a threat. Okay? If I threaten to you, the other side is often very surprised at just how negative your reaction can be. The influencer many times does not know what they are losing in the forcing of coercive power on the target. The target many times is less satisfied with the financial rewards that they receive. The target is less satisfied by the non-financial rewards it receives. To threaten also makes the target feel like their entire relationship is conflict-ridden. And ultimately what happens is the target becomes less committed. Why do I want to hang around an abusive relationship? Coercion is corrosive. Coercive power has to be used as a last resort. The very end of a difficult spiral. Now, expert power. I was a fairly good salesman in the 80s, but not that great. I'll be honest. There's some people that are natural salespeople, and if you're one of those people, good for you. All right. My way that I was a salesperson was that I invested very heavily in professional learning. Professional learning is different from personal learning. Being a lifelong reader is one of those things. Being a professional reader means that you're always very much invested in your education, hopefully to achieve higher goals. And especially when you're a young person like I was, you love to hear yourself. You love to let everybody know how smart you are. Well, the problem with that is that eventually you can let the entire cat out of the bag and you can educate your potential clients and they can go somewhere else to find a cheaper price. And that was my fatal. Machiavelli, this is a suggestion. Machiavelli said, if you want to appear smart, say less of what you know rather than more. Because if you say less, people will always assume you know more. And so, keep your pearls of wisdom as much as you can. Do not cast your pearls before swine, which is another saying. Okay. The difficulty with that is that expert power, it's also called expertise. If you see expertise power or expert power, it means the same thing. Just realize that knowledge can go away in a moment. You can divide expert power into expertise, which is your ability to make smart judgments, and information sources, which is general knowledge. I was very good at general knowledge. It took me a while to get expertise. And I don't know if I was ever that good in it. It's not easy. Channel members must be trusted. Experts are usually accorded very high status. And here's the difficulty. When you're trying to inform people, not everybody likes to be around a know-it-all. And I was a real know-it-all, okay? I'm bearing my soul. Anyway, how do you stop yourself from giving away your power if you have expertise power? Well, one of the things that you need to do is to dole it out in small portions. Like I said, Machiavelli said, say less of what you know. I mean, you don't have to go on any YouTube video or any advertisement wherever you go and see that it's always, this is the most important thing you've ever seen that makes you run a click through. That's an example. The second is invest in professional knowledge or professional learning. Constantly upgrade your expertise. Always become a new person, all right? Don't stay static because the world is not either. Be the one who knows what's the newest thing coming down the pipe. and transmit only customized knowledge. This is what I mean by this is transaction specific. And so by transaction specific, I mean only talk about what the subject of that moment is. Don't elaborate. If they want to know more, said, hire me and I'll tell you. Invite the investment into you that you have put in it yourself. Don't give away the farm. Expert power is one of the most delicate of all the powers there is. All right. But, you know, don't do stuff like I did. And so this is expert power. Legitimate power has two forms. There's known as legal legitimate, and there's also what's known as traditional legitimate. Legal and traditional. Legal legitimate power is conferred by governments stemming from nations' laws and commerce, contracts, and written obligations. Traditional legitimates stem from the company's sense that I am in some way obligated to comply with the requests of the influencer. Traditional legitimate is situated around norms. Norms are expected ways of behavior. Things like role integrity. We all expect for individuals to act in a given manner. In my generation, and I can't help it, whenever I address someone, I say sir or ma'am out of respect. This is an example of traditional legitimate power. Whenever I meet someone of a higher rank, I address them by their title. There are many societies that are much more structured than that. But it gives you kind of an essence of what legal legitimate and traditional legitimate is. So this is a true story. This is built around my experiences when I was running the internet service provider. And this is a perfect example of what traditional legitimate legal legitimate is. So I started internet service provider, got up to 1,800 subscribers, started having 70 high-speed DSL suppliers. This is also when you had dial-up internet. So in 2005, 2006, Walmart came out with $5 internet. Literally, it started crashing my business. I lost about 600 subscribers. I was making at one point $45,000 a month business, and then I could see this going down, and I had to play out. I asked South Central Bell at the time to restructure my contracts and was willing even to show them that I wasn't going to be able to survive. South Central Bell said, you're obligated to fulfill your contracts. You owe $18,000 and pay tomorrow. Otherwise, you're going to be shut down. I started paying in little bits as I could along the way, but eventually I had a debt of about $120,000, and I was in a desperate situation, and I didn't know what to do. So I talked to my lawyer at the time, is a gentleman by the name of Forrest Danton. I was in Marion County in Mississippi in a small town called Columbia. Forrest Danton was an attorney there in Columbia. He was also the circuit judge as well. And he was able to have clear boundaries on where his responsibilities and obligations were as a judge as well as a lawyer. I gave Forrest Danton free high-speed access. He gave me free legal advice. A good man in every sense of the word. He was a deacon in the church. One of the nicest individuals I have ever met in my life. And so the night before, or like a week before everything was coming to pass, I went to Forrest and I bared my soul, told him where we are. I didn't know what to do. I was getting calls every night demanding that I pay these things over and over again. And I didn't even have the money to be able to do all of these things. And so Forrest, after listening to me for 10 minutes, go on, the calm settled down and Forrest said, F them. Forrest was a deacon of a church. I never heard him use those words in my life. But Forrest was saying that in a professional way, not saying it in a personal way. And I went, excuse me? And he said, David, I'm the one who put together your contracts. You own nothing. You just work for the corporation. The corporation is the one that has those legal bills. You don't. He said, trust me, close down your business, go on with your life. They can't touch you. So that's exactly what I did. And that's also at the point where I decided that it was time for me to move on. And that's ultimately why I'm standing here before you. So think of it this way. Legal or traditional legitimate was they were demanding that I accept the situational norms and accept the obligations that I was supposed to have for paying my bills. Meanwhile, Forrest said legally, they can't touch you. You have no legal obligation to pay them. And so this is an example of traditional legitimate power and legal legitimate power, and which one wins over the other. Okay? So the moral of the story is if you're going to go into business, get a good lawyer. Okay? So referent power. Referent power exists when B views A as a standard of reference and wish to be identified with A. This is a very powerful thing to have. A can confer prestige on B just by being associated and even saying a kind word. This is influencers, folks. This is the world of YouTube and any other influencers that you wish to speak of. Referring back to the last two chapters, this is what Duncan Hines conferred on Harlan Sanders. There's pride of carrying a brand. You pride yourself. The values that are carried by that brand are associated with the individuals. Referent power may be the strongest of all. But referent power is also hardwired into the individuals who believe the influencer. And so let me kind of group these all together. If you look in leadership psychology, I urge you all to take classes in leadership. The very last class I ever took in my life when I got my graduate degree was leadership psychology. And I swear to you, I wish it was the first thing I ever did because I could have understand what leaders were about. I was so confused when I was in your ages, wondering what motivates individuals. I just didn't understand. And if you understand what leadership is and why people do the things they do, it can make your life a whole lot easier, or it may at least make the world a little bit more understandable. All right. So, expert power, referent power, and traditional, legitimate, these are all together what are called personal power. They are conferred upon individuals. My individual ability is what personal power is. Legal, legitimate, reward power, and curse power. Yeah, I can draw this without, it's all confusing anyway. All right. These are what are known as position power. Reward, coercive, and legal legitimate power are what are known as position power. It is in the nature of the hierarchy of organizations that confers the power in and of itself. I say this also because I want you in your careers to consider investing in your own personal power. Become experts. Understand the situational norms in the organizations in which you work in. You may not be able to change things, but at least you can understand them. And then referent power. Be one of those individuals who can convey strength. You will be sought out. You will be rewarded for it as well. And understand the difference between where you are in the positions and where you are as a person. Okay? The serenity prayer is, God, allow me to change the things I can, accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's a reason it's called the serenity prayer too, okay? And so last, let's group those together. There's two ways to group these together. Coercive power really only exists in one of the powers, and that's coercion, naturally. Everything else is non-coercive. Coercive equals corrosive. Mediated power is when the target is forced to acknowledge the power base. And so this is position power. This is reward, this is coercion, and legal legitimate. Unmediated bases of power are those that would not exist without the target's perception. If the target does not perceive you as having these powers, then you don't. This is why, especially when it comes to expert and referent power, it can go away. And so one of the things I want you to take away from this lesson is to understand today that power exists, you have power, and you can invest in having greater power as well. And your ability to be able to use your powers to the best of your benefit ultimately is going to decide whether you will succeed as an organization and, of course, as an individual. And although sometimes, especially when it comes to unmediated power, You really don't necessarily have any choices, but it can make it a little bit easier on your life, and you can have a drink and at least get over it, okay? Sometimes it's the only thing that helps. Okay. Speaking of which, all right, I think we're done for the day. I will have your grades by tomorrow, promise. By the way, if any of you would like to go to that, tomorrow, one of App State's alumni is the person who created the, oh gosh, what is it? The Stanley Cup. She is the actual individual who created the Stanley Cup. And if you would like to listen to her, she graduated in 1992 from App State, and she's heading the marketing organization. There's a few spaces still left. I just got an email. So if you email Dr. Albinson, she's the one coordinating that thing. There's like 5 spaces left. So just to let you know. Okay. All right, folks. Y'all have a good, yes. Yeah, y'all need to take the test. All right.